I've counted today that it is my 5th week of quarantine, so the entire experience is basically jumping into the next months. And I was trying to summarize what kind of feelings did it make me feel, and I thought about two things. The first one is this constant feeling of being overwhelmed with time, the experience of having perhaps too much time sometimes, and feeling is this kind of feeling of being stuck in the same scenery. Yes, you experience it without the quarantine as well, but I feel like now it is kind of exaggerated. And I've been trying to escape this feeling of routine, of kind of sameness, I don't know, by reading. And I guess the other way with which you can escape this feeling of being stuck in a routine is by doing something creative, which for me is YouTube. So I was thinking, what should I record as my next video for this channel, and came across this footage that I made back in February in London of a very beautiful work of art made by karawalker. She's an American contemporary artist, and I think we can all use this footage now to kind of escape this routine feeling and also learn something new about one of the most interesting American contemporary artists who is exploring the topics of race, social classes and politics. And the art object that I'm going to talk about is called Fons Americanus. Worker made it last year in 2019. She was the 5th artist who was invited to participate in a special project called Hyundai Commission. It's an annual project which invites artists to do a special installation specifically for the Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern. And I guess the main question that Walker asks you at the viewer in this piece is how you remember history. And what role do public monuments play in your remembrance? Because sometimes you could notice that public monuments in particular sort of dictate the way we need to perceive certain historical figures or certain historical events. And the thing with public monuments is that they are basically symbols of power. They always reflect opinions and views of the ruling government. And exactly for this reason, when certain governments change, certain monuments also fall. I think one of my favorite scenes on these processes is a scene from this movie called Goodbye Lenin from 2003, where you see the sculpture of Lenin being dismantled and waving goodbye to the mother of the main character who fell earlier in coma in the GDR, but who woke up after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this is an example of how one ideology changes and the public monuments change accordingly. But what about public monuments that are still there but no longer reflect that reality that we live in today or the truth that we may know? How do we communicate with this kind of public monuments? And this is exactly the subject of Walker's piece. She takes as a reference for her sculpture the Victoria Memorial, which was constructed in 1920s in front of the Buckingham Palace in London. And this is a monument that was constructed, I think, in other different parts of Great Britain and in its colonies in the beginning of the 19th century as a sort of a symbol for the heights of the empire. And Walker takes this sculpture and completely subverts it and shows a different truth kind of behind it. How exactly does she do it? If you could imagine yourself entering the Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern in London, you would see first a smaller part of the sculpture called Shell Grotto. It shows a very famous symbol from art history, from these Renaissance sculptures and paintings that show an episode from the Greek mythology about the birth of Venus, which is always portrayed standing on this type of a scalloped shell. But here we see the narrative is completely transformed, and inside the shell we see a boy almost completely submerged by water. He's drowning, he's weeping, and here we see that Walker is transforming the birth narrative into a death narrative, which kind of sets the tone for the entire sculpture and for the entire project. And then we kind of walk through and see the monument itself, the fountain itself. And here we see that water is not represented as a symbol of power, naval forces, or even economic development, but a symbol of suffering and of slave trading, because in the fountain we see people getting sick, we see sinking boats, we see sharks posing threats. The water in Walker's piece becomes a sort of a symbol for the Atlantic Ocean, the ocean that connects America, Europe and Africa together, and there is quite an interesting statistic saying that between the end of the 14th century and the beginning of the 18th century, 2/3 of people who crossed the Atlantic Ocean were African people, and this quite violent process of migration couldn't not have an effect on the consciousness of people who were migrating. And in 1993, a British art historian, Paul Gilroy, proposed a term called Black Atlantic, which describes this fusion of cultures and how different cultures merge in this one Black consciousness. And Walker's piece, Fons Americanus at the Tate Modern, exactly shows an example of that, an example of how artists critically perceive parts of the culture which she also belongs to. And I also read an interesting fact about sharks on the Tate website, which said that it was quite common for enslaved people to get sick on these ships, and they would be thrown away into water, and sharks would be always following these ships because they kind of knew that there would be plenty of food. But these paths of ships were unusual for sharks to follow, but they still follow it up to today, which shows what a huge impact this many centuries of slave trading had. And then on the second level of this fountain we see also an interesting set of quite subversive alternative figures. We see in the front the sitting captain, who represents all the rebellions that were happening against the system of slave trading. And originally in the Victoria Memorial on this place we see Queen Victoria, the person or the historical figure who is holding the empire together, who is keeping it in the status quo. And in Walker's fountain we see the figure who is trying to change the way the system works. And also on the same second level we see two-sided sculptures, which originally in the Victoria Memorial represent truth and justice, but here justice is again transformed into a tree with a noose hanging from it, which symbolizes executions against the empire rebellions. And kind of on the opposite side of it we see the captain, kind of the colonizer, kneeling and being in this sort of submissive position and not in a position of power. And the last sculpture in this second floor section represents motherhood, and here we can see an African woman holding a coconut, which is a symbol of life and vitality, but kind of at the bottom of her legs we see a crouching figure, which symbolizes the suffering and difficulties of motherhood, depending on social classes and on race that you belong to in this system. And at the top of the sculpture we see the figure of Venus, but not portrayed in this classical form from Greek mythology, but portrayed as an African woman. kind of becomes the final voice in this story. And I think we can all find the examples of public monuments that make us somehow uncomfortable with the images they portray. Or sometimes not necessarily uncomfortable, but we see different sides of this monument. And I found it quite interesting to think of these examples when I was looking at this karawalker's piece. So please like this video if you found it interesting, share your opinions if you want to, and subscribe to this channel not to miss anything new and not less exciting here. Bye bye!